We've been working with a statement by Thurman Arnold in a book called The Symbols of Government, which was that great constructive achievements in human organization have been accomplished by unscrupulous men who violated most of the principles we cherish. So far, we've analyzed John D. Rockefeller in 2 talks. We've dealt with the phenomenon of the economic cartel. Today, we're going to move into the realm of the political cartel, and we're going to deal with Boss Tweed. The name of this session is The Tweed Ring Unravels. He who loves money will never have enough of it. For as wealth increases, so do those who will spend it. That's from Ecclesiastes, verse 8. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. It's from Federalist 51. The year is 1871. The month is January. The day is Tuesday, the 24th of January. Snow blankets the ground in Central Park, and the surrounding roads are also filled with snow. James Watson, the New York County Auditor, was a horseman. He prided himself on his racehorses and on his ability to handle a team in a sleigh. So, as he climbed aboard his 2-horse sleigh late that Tuesday afternoon, he edged aside his coachman, Sylvanus Townsend, and he took the reins himself. It was a great night for sledding. The wind was brisk, and there was just the right amount of snow cover to make the sleigh glide easily along the tracks already worn in the streets and paths. And so Watson raced the sleigh over Madison Avenue, and then east to Yorkville, and then back into the park, and finally up to Harlem, where he stopped at the local Tammany clubhouse to warm himself before a roaring fire and to sip champagne. Up in the sky was darkening, and there was a rough crowd on the streets. And Watson and the coachman did not dare tarry too long at the clubhouse. Time to get on the road and get back on the well-worn tracks, because they could be too well-worn now and become uncontrollable ruts. At 138th Street, it happened. A horse out of control approached from the opposite direction, bolted, and then dashed across in front of him. And for all his expertise, Watson couldn't control his own team. The other horse slammed into them. In the melee, hoofs flew through the air. One struck Watson in the forehead. The coachman, who had been thrown to the street, looked up to see Watson lying unconscious on the sleigh. But Watson soon recovered consciousness, walked back up the road to the clubhouse, where his wound was dressed, and then went home. Over the next few days, the wound healed nicely. But within a week after the accident, Watson would become feverish and fall once again into unconsciousness. Within days, he would be dead. And thus began the unraveling of the infamous Tweed ring. For it was Watson who, as county auditor, served as paymaster for the myriad of contractors who did business with the city of New York. Watson, who had once spent time in the Ludlow Street jail as a convicted felon, now as county auditor, increased the contractors' payments by 50 to 65%, as directed by New York City Controller Dick Connolly. Watson, a creative bookkeeper, had once ingratiated himself to the warden of Ludlow Prison and earned his early release. Now, in his current iteration as New York County Auditor, Watson paid tribute to the Tweed ring in the exacting proportions ordained by Connolly and by William Marcy Tweed, the boss of Tammany. Estimates of the graft over the last 4 years of Watson's reign as county auditor range from $45 to $75 million. No one's ever ascertained the exact amount, though many have tried. Leads to some of the luster around Tweed. Multiply by 20 in today's money, and the amounts are in the billions. The graft was unparalleled in American history, both before and since. But let's place the event in context. In January 1871, Ulysses S. Grant, President of the United States, was about to become mired in scandals, which he did not generate and in which he did not knowingly participate, but which he could not control. The United States was in the midst of the so-called Gilded Age, perhaps best described by Kenneth Ackerman in his book entitled The Golden Ring, as a period of unbridled greed, conspicuous consumption, casual corruption, and ruthless acquisition. Exactly 1 year before, in January 1870, as we saw last week, Clevelander John D. Rockefeller, a mere 31 years of age, together with his closest friend and business associate Henry Morrison Flagler, replaced the firm of Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler with a corporation bearing a very generic-sounding name, Standard Oil of Ohio. George Armstrong Custer, having graduated dead last in his class at West Point, was still 5 years away from leading the 7th Cavalry into a disastrous massacre by the Sioux Indians near the Little Bighorn River in the Dakota Territory. John Roebling, the designer and progenitor of the Brooklyn Bridge, had already been killed in a barge accident during preliminary work on the bridge. But his talented son, Washington Roebling, who had enthusiastically taken up his father's legacy, had just engineered the launch of the first 3,000-ton caisson on the Brooklyn side. Under his hands-on supervision, hundreds of workmen would help the monstrous caisson drill itself into the bedrock of the East River deep underwater with the aid of an ingenious array of airlocks and water shafts. The endeavor would eventually cause Roebling to succumb to the bends. But the indomitable Roebling would thereafter supervise the completion of the bridge from an apartment at 97 Columbia Heights in Brooklyn Heights. That was eventually become my bachelor pad and the site of some of the very wildest parties in New York in the 50s. In January 1871, along with the launch of the bridge caissons, two rather diffuse careers were also in the process of being launched. One, that of a politician, the other, that of an already popular sketch artist. Both would have a profound effect on the unraveling of the Tweed ring. First, the sketch artist. Thomas Nast, the immigrant son of a musician from Bavaria and one of the most talented political cartoon artists of his generation, was a backer of causes. You would not have noticed Nast in a crowd. He was short and pudgy, so much so that his art teachers referred to him as the little fat Dutch boy. Although he grew a goatee, it was not particularly eye-catching. But Giuseppe Garibaldi noticed. For at age 18, the young illustrator Nast joined Garibaldi's famous March of Unification from Genoa to Naples, Italy. He threw himself into the cause sporting a red bandana, a Garibaldi cap, and a red shirt, and his drawings of the March to Risorgimento appeared regularly in the New York Illustrated News. Nast, a Republican, admired Abraham Lincoln and was present to Sketch's inauguration. Nast gained fame and endured death threats for his emotional Union-biased frontline drawings of Civil War battlefields. By this time, he was securely entrenched as the lead illustrator of Harper's Weekly, with a circulation of 100,000, an estimated readership of 500,000, both national and international. Lincoln would credit Nast with having turned the tide in New York in his second-term election against pacifist General George McClellan. On the Saturday before the election, Harper's Weekly had published Nast's searing cartoon depicting ghosts of dead Union soldiers hovering over northern anti-war copperheads who were in the process of stealing the votes of dead heroes in a military burial ground. It packed an emotional wallop, and Lincoln carried the crucial New York popular vote by a bare 50.5% to 49.5%. Now, at the time, the interests of Democratic Tammany and those of Republican Nast were aligned. The artist had not yet turned his devastating talents on Tweed. After all, it was Tweed who had almost single-handedly devised and implemented a successful conscription scheme which quelled the violence that had erupted among his Irish constituents in the New York draft riots. So the notorious Tweed was actually a great hero to Lincoln. Gettysburg had been a defining event in Lincoln's presidency, but the victory which preceded the immortal address might well have proved Pyrrhic, as the Union losses had been staggering. Secretary Stanton credited Tweed's Tammany with having provided the Union Army with 116,382 recruits during the critical months following Gettysburg and the New York City draft riots, when Union ranks were depleted. But for Nast, the man of causes, there were no shades. Things were black or they were white. They were right or they were wrong. They were moral or they were immoral. Nast detested Catholics, and he detested the Irish. He was an Orangeman and a Republican, and he saw around him the pervasive graft and corruption of the Tammany administration, from the cop on the beat and the judges on the bench to the mayor's office and the governor's mansion, all of which he equated with the dominance of the Democrats and Irish Catholicism. And so it was perhaps inevitable that Nast would turn his immense talents on Tammany and the Tweed Ring. Although these attacks began in 1869 and continued throughout 1870, they intensified significantly after the disastrous Orangemen's March in New York City in July of 1871 to commemorate the victory at the Battle of the Boyne. Nast was a uniform participant in that fatal march, and he credited Irish-leading Tammany administration with purposely allowing uncontrolled mobs to destroy the parade, causing multiple deaths in the ensuing chaos. So devastating did his graphic attacks now become that at one point, Tweed, exasperated, is reputed to have shouted out, "Stop them damn pictures! I don't care what the papers write about me. My constituents can't read. But damn it, they can see pictures." Tweed's physiognomy lent itself to parody. His head was shaped like a pear, jowly at the bottom, narrowing at the top, and balding. It was like a prelude to the stem of the pear. His body, too, was shaped like a pear, with his lower body's enormous girth narrowing at the neck and head. So as caricatured, Tweed often looked like a large pear and a small pear in vertical alignment. In this matter, Tweed was easily depicted as gluttonous, Falstaffian, eventually becoming a laughingstock. Nothing devastates like humor. The Tammany Tiger, a symbol originally derived from Tweed's volunteer fire company, was transformed by Nast's biting pen from a fierce protector of the helpless and poverty-ridden to a snarling predator, often baring his fangs and devouring both the defenseless public and its treasury. At first Tammany, but then increasingly Tweed himself, became the focal point of Nast's attacks, which were as relentless as they were ruthless. It was a focused graphic attack which many believe is without parallel to this day. It is the phenomenon most identified with the long and illustrious career of Thomas Nast, a career, by the way, that gave us, among other things, the Democratic donkey, the Republican elephant, and that rotund, white-bearded, belly-laughing image of Santa Claus we see every Christmas. In 1868, William Marcy Tweed, age 45, undisputed boss of Tammany, was approaching the height of his power. He was the master of the universe. The vaunted Tweed Ring had been formed, it was empowered, and its control of all three branches of government was definitive, in effect, a political cartel. What was the infamous Ring, and how did it control New York? Actually, the Ring consisted of only 4 men, all made incredibly powerful and seemingly invincible by a New York City charter amendment. There was, of course, Boss Tweed himself, about to be crowned Grand Sachem of Tammany. In 1871, Tweed had just completed construction of a 3-story clubhouse, or wigwam as they called it. It would seat 5,000 people, and it would be chosen to house the Democratic National Convention that year. During the convention, Tweed's Duane Street office in Manhattan would temporarily but symbolically become the seat of the Democratic National Committee. Tweed had already succeeded in electing John Hoffman as governor of New York, was now being touted as a kingmaker in the forthcoming presidential election. Meteoric rise. Tweed was vulgar. He was a boisterous, in-your-face, backslapping, two-fisted ward politician. Tweed, of Scotch Presbyterian descent, came from a working-class family of chairmakers. He had begun his political career as a brawling volunteer firefighter with the Big Six Fire Company, also called the Americas Company. With his massive frame, he had led his fellow firefighters to the glories and the great spoils of fire rescue in mid-19th century New York. Many of you may have seen this graphically depicted in the film The Gangs of New York. But Tweed was also a great charmer and a wonderful storyteller. Thus, starting with his election in 1852 to the Common Council, which is often critically referred to as the 40 Thieves, he had worked his way up to the top of the Tammany ladder with an adroit combination of carrot and stick tactics. The second member of the quartet was the tight-fisted city controller, Richard Connolly, nicknamed Slippery Dick. Connolly, a former bank clerk, had earned his nickname the hard way. He was not only thoroughly dishonest, he was disloyal as well, changing sides with all the ease of a chameleon changing color. The third member of the foursome was Peter Sweeney, nicknamed the Brains. He was a city chamberlain. Sweeney, clearly the cleverest of the group, was a humorless Keynesian character who preferred to lurk in the shadows and work out of sight. Rounding out the ring was the Honorable Mayor, Oakey Hall, nicknamed Elegant Oakey. Elegant Oakey was something of a swaggering Renaissance man. He had served as a successful district attorney, trial lawyer. He was a bon vivant, a fashion plate, a playwright, and a professional actor. Hall craved applause and basked in the limelight. The four of them, the boss, the Brains, Slippery Dick, and Elegant Oakey, were seemingly inseparable. What a group. They would meet for lunch almost daily to parcel out patronage, devise ways to stuff ballot boxes, double count votes, dole out bribes, and raid the city treasury. But the master stratagem that cemented their absolute power was the New York City Charter Amendment, which was fiendishly devised by Brains Sweeney to demolish what had been left of the separation of powers in New York City. This is critical. The measure had literally been bribed through the state legislature that year by Tweed. Tweed, already a state senator and chairman of New York City's legislative body, the New York Board of Supervisors, would soon be named Commissioner of Public Works, and Sweeney would be appointed to head the Public Parks Board. Under the charter, as now conveniently amended, these positions would control literally thousands of patronage jobs. Even more important, both commissioners would now be appointed by Mayor Elegant Oakey, unchecked by the Board of Aldermen. That board had just been stripped by the Charter Amendment of its power to approve the appointments. Moreover, the commissioners' terms were respectively 6 and 8 years, time enough for the ring to amass an insurmountable political base through control of both patronage and the flow of cash. It was rather like owning Boardwalk and Park Place on a monopoly board with hotels. Slippery Dick Connolly as controller and Brains Sweeney as city chamberlain, positions likewise rendered untouchable by the Charter Amendment, had a chokehold on the city treasury. All city budgeting and payments to contractors passed through their offices, and it was they who directed the ill-fated county auditor, James Watson, to handle remittances. It was a neat ring. The city debt tripled during the short 3-year period 1868 to 1871. The graft alone has been estimated at close to $1 billion in today's money. No one knows for sure. The speculation merely adds to Tweed's luster and his immortality. For there was a certain Robin Hood quality about Tweed. Despite the ever-pervasive graft and corruption, he becomes something of an urban legend in his time. Physically imposing, larger than life, Tweed brooked no more interference in political battles than he had in street fights with rival gangs of firefighters. On the plus side, Tweed was an achiever in the Thurman Arnold mold. Many of his ambitious projects not only benefited both rich and poor alike, but were the source of great civic pride as well. We enjoy a number of them today. For example, New York State Senator Tweed introduced bills chartering and funding the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the New York Stock Exchange. He supported the New York Presbyterian Hospital, Mount Sinai Hospital, as well as orphanages and schools. He extended Lexington Avenue, widened Broadway from 34th to 49th Street, was active in launching the Brooklyn Bridge, and built a significant new courthouse. Much to the delight of the financiers, Tweed had spent millions on improving Central Park, which set off, of course, a real estate boom in the surrounding areas and added significantly to the city's tax base. As an extra dividend, his civic projects provided work on streets, reservoirs, and buildings to literally thousands of immigrant blue-collar laborers, those that had no other professional or business skills but could dig and haul dirt and stone. It was the Gilded Age, all right, but Tweed's constituency was anything but gilded. They lived downtown in and around the notorious 5 Points, on streets with names like Murderer's Alley and Cow Bay. They sweltered in the summer and they near froze to death in the winter. Decaying tenements, living among rats and vermin. The elitist 19th century diarist George Templeton Strong described their plight this way, quote, "Yet we have our 5 points, our emigrant quarters, our swarms of seamstresses to whom their utmost toil and monotonous daily drudgery gives only bare subsistence, a life barren of hope and of enjoyment. Our hordes of dock thieves and of children who live in the streets and by them. No one can walk the length of Broadway without meeting some hideous troop of ragged girls, 12 years down, brutalized already almost beyond redemption by premature vice, clad in the filthy refuse of the rag pickers' collections, obscene of speech, the stamp of childhood gone from their faces," end quote. Seymour Mandelbaum in the book Boss Tweed's New York describes the scene this way, quote, "New York shouted its poverty. The census takers recorded its ignorance. At least 43,000 persons above the age of 10 could not read any language. 62,000 more could not write. A still larger group, of course, was unable to read or write English. American cities, the Times warned in 1871, were filled with men and women who drudge year after year in fruitless labor. They never rise above their position. They see the gilded rewards of toil all about them, can never grasp them." Tweed catered to the immigrant Irish and German populace, trading jobs, food, and schooling for their votes. Often many votes from each of them on the same day, stuffed into ballot boxes, and then counted twice or 3 times the same evening, after the gas lights conveniently went out and when the ballot boxes were open. Tweed always maintained that it was not so much the voting as the counting that mattered. But fixed or not, his election victories instilled a certain pride in his often forlorn constituents. But in the process, he certainly didn't overlook William Marcy Tweed. Unless we get carried away with the Sherwood Forest analogy, the heroic brigand Robin Hood did not sport a 10.5-carat diamond stick pin worth $300,000 in today's money, or wear showy clothes, or buy multiple yachts even though he was seasick, and multiple homes in prime neighborhoods like New York and Greenwich, Connecticut. George Washington Plunkett, leader of the 15th election district, was one of the most influential and successful Tammany politicians in New York City for over a quarter of a century, and he died a millionaire. His office was a bootblack stand of the New York County Courthouse. Amazing. Never had anything more than that as an office. I've got to tell you just one saying of George Washington Plunkett. "A man that'd expect to train lobsters to fly in a year is called a lunatic, and they put him away. But a man that thinks men can be turned into angels by an election is called a reformer and remains at large." In a series of interviews with journalist William Reardon, published as Plunkett of Tammany Hall, he gave this pointed advice to aspiring Tammany leaders, quote, "Live like your neighbors, even if you have the means to live better. Make the poorest man in your district feel that he is equal or even a bit superior to you." Now, this man died a multimillionaire. As he rose through the ranks from volunteer firefighter to grand sachem, unfortunately, Tweed lost sight of this sage warning. Tweed lived high, and he lived ostentatiously. And so it was that the New York Times was to run the following headline on June 1, 1871, quote, "A costly wedding," end quote. It was a gross understatement. Here are a few choice excerpts, quote, "At 7 o'clock last evening, Miss Mary Amelia Tweed, daughter of William Marcy Tweed of New York, was married to Arthur Ambrose McGinnis of New Orleans. The wedding was a most expensive affair. The ceremony took place at Trinity Chapel before a richly dressed audience. After the ceremony was concluded, the party drove at once to Mr. Tweed's palatial mansion, corner of 43rd Street and 5th Avenue, whither they were followed by the notables who were present at the ceremony and such of the undistinguished as had been honored with invitations to this grand reception." Robin Hood would have loved the undistinguished. The article gurgled on for several over-the-top paragraphs about floral arrangements, and then came the seemingly endless loot, which included 2 sterling silver contraptions for making ice cream, sporting sterling silver icebergs with bears climbing all over them, and even up the icicle handles of the sterling silver spoons. The wedding dress cost $5,000, $100,000 in today's dollars. The Tribune estimated the overall cost of the gifts at $14 million in today's money. 27-year-old James O'Brien, nicknamed Jimmy, was not one of the notables named by the Gushing Society editor of the Times. He was not even among the so-called undistinguished guests that followed the notables like lemmings uptown to gawk at the priceless gifts and a Tweed splendid mansion on Fifth Avenue. O'Brien was a tough, bullheaded street kid who had come from one of the toughest Irish wards in the city. Jimmy had battled his way up the ranks of Tammany with his fists. He'd already been elected New York County Sheriff on a Tammany ticket and had played a major role in the victorious election of 1868. As sheriff, he had deputized close to 2,000 strong-arm types on Election Day to simply round up most of the Republican poll watchers, keep them locked up in jail, especially during lights-out vote counting time, and then they would, of course, release them the next day. After the election sweep, however, Jimmy and a group of young Turks had split with Tammany. They'd split over the division of money. It wasn't a matter of principle, and power. They formed a group called the Young Democrats, so-called reformers, although in fact they were just grafters and bribers on training wheels. O'Brien, having resultantly lost the Tammany nod for re-election as sheriff, put in for an expense account of $350,000 while he was in office. The tab was no doubt grossly exaggerated. Young Jimmy had learned his lessons well from Connolly, but he was bluntly turned down by the tight-fisted controller, Connolly. But O'Brien was street tough. He retaliated by secretly infiltrating a friendly out-of-work accountant named Bill Copeland into Connolly's staff. Now, Copeland was fortuitously seated in a room right next to the county auditor, James Watson, and he was assigned the seemingly mundane task of filing vouchers from contractors. He could not have been more strategically positioned. Under O'Brien's direction from outside, Copeland was soon secretly copying the voucher records, all of them. Copeland had amassed proof before long of the most monumental fraud in municipal history, and he dutifully turned all of his copies over to his benefactor, young Jimmy O'Brien. O'Brien approached Connolly and Tweed and Sweeney and advised them what he possessed and demanded that they pay his $350,000 account. Multiply by 20, you'll know what he was asking for. At first they resisted this outright attempt at blackmail, but then the trio rethought the matter. They determined to approach O'Brien to recapture the records, but their emissary this time would be James Watson. After all, the records were filched under Watson's watch. Both Watson and O'Brien were superb horsemen, and they made a date to go riding and have lunch together in Central Park to negotiate the turnover. Before the lunch, however, Watson was dead. The talks never materialized. The freakish development would prove fatal to the Tweed ring. In July 1871, George Jones was in trouble. As the new publisher of the New York Times, Jones had been on Tweed's trail since 1870. But in the fall of 1870, a blue ribbon panel, headed by the formidable John Vincent Astor, had investigated Tammany at Jones' urging and whitewashed Tammany and the ring for lack of proof. Astor was beyond reproach. Jones and his new crusading managing editor from England, Lewis B. Jennings, were effectively out on a limb. Jennings' claims of sinecures and city government now fell on deaf ears. There was no proof. And besides, Wall Street loved Tweed. The city's economy was booming. Dozens of new city projects were sprouting up all the time. Property values were rising. Taxes were low. Foreign investors such as the House of Rothschild, through their U.S. representative August Belmont, were snapping up New York City bonds. Moreover, much to Jones' dismay, Ownership of the Times was reportedly now in play. Henry Raymond, part owner of the Times, had died recently. His widow was seeking an accounting, and there were rumors that the Tweed ring, backed by the notorious duo of Jim Fisk and Jay Gould, who will meet next week, were bidding on her stock. If they succeeded in buying the Times, Jennings knew they were finished. It was amidst this gloom pervading the Times that Jimmy O'Brien appeared on the night of July 18, 1871, and unceremoniously dumped a large envelope on Jennings' desk in the boardroom. Contained Copeland's entire work product. Manna had just fallen from heaven, and Jones and Jennings wasted no time. 4 days later, the Times 4-column banner headline said it all. Quote, "The secret accounts, proof of undoubted frauds brought to light, warrants signed by Hall and Connolly under false pretenses," end quote. And there they were, in black and white, spread all over the front page. $5,663,646 of charges, which had found their way to one company, Ingersoll and Company, ostensibly for cabinet work and courthouse furniture. The courthouse was built of marble, not wood, and the Times snidely estimated the chairs, ostensibly purchased from Ingersoll, would have stretched 17 miles, placed end to end. Ingersoll was conveniently owned by Tweed's brother and a close friend of the family. 2 daily installments on the Times front page followed in close succession, this time dealing with $2,876,000 to Garvey and Company, allegedly for plastering, and $1.2 million to Kaiser and Company for plumbing on the new courthouse, both patently padded bills. The tide of public opinion now turned swiftly. Wall Street looked on horrified as the value of New York City bonds plummeted. European investors, fearing municipal bankruptcy, were already dumping them in a panic. Banks and brokerage houses flush with New York City paper were suddenly in jeopardy of failing. The free lunch was over. The unraveling of the ring was now underway in earnest. When the bankers and the merchants returned from their summer retreats in early September, they marshaled their forces. Thousands of concerned citizens crowded into an overflowing Cooper Union. Interminable moralistic harangues and sermons followed, and a reform committee of 70, I have my doubts about committees of 70, was formed to pursue the scoundrels and to oust them once and for all from City Hall. One personality, however, was conspicuously absent. Democratic State Chairman Samuel Jones Tilden was a powerful political loner. Unique in a world of greeters and backslappers, Tilden was often described as a stuffed shirt, aloof, unapproachable. He never married and reportedly proudly revealed to a friend at age 65 that he'd never had sex. But he was a demon for work. His law practice and his work in government had become an obsession. Tilden had been chronically ill as a child and had often been removed from school for long periods and privately tutored at home. Perhaps as a result, he developed a number of personal traits which would define him as an adult. Among these was a penchant for secretiveness, remember Rockefeller, and a marked ability to solve puzzles. Tilden, who came from a wealthy and politically connected family, to begin with, became independently wealthy on his own right through prudent investments together with a lucrative practice of railroad law. He proved to be a master in the field at the time when railroads were rapidly expanding throughout the country. But it was his puzzle-solving ability which is about to catapult Tilden in 4 short years from New York State Democratic chairman to New York State governor, and finally to his fateful presidential campaign against Rutherford B. Hayes, one of the closest in our political history. Tilden detested Tweed, but as Democratic chairman, he had steered a rather neutral path around the Tweed ring. He had to. The Times' July 22 headline had been sensational, but there was a sequential element missing. There was as yet no evidence directly linking the Tweed ring to the outrageous payments to Messrs. Ingersoll, Garvey, and Kaiser. Tilden would supply that link. The tide had already turned against the Tweed ring. The first to jump ship was Slippery Dick Connolly. It happened like this. The Committee of 70, with nothing to go on but the Times article, commenced an injunctive proceeding against Comptroller Connolly to prevent any further money-raising or expenditure of city or county funds without the approval of the newly formed Committee of 70. Ironically, one of Tweed's most loyal judges, George Barnard, who will also meet next week, fearing public retribution and notwithstanding the lack of any legal precedent, summarily granted the injunction. The injunction froze the Comptroller's office in place. There was little cash on hand. Connolly had planned another in a long line of bond issues to pay salaries and interest. Barnard's order blocked that. The city couldn't pay wages. Unruly mobs of unpaid city workers now began to form daily outside Connolly's office. They dogged him wherever he went. He hired bodyguards. Then immediately following Barnard's order, someone broke into Connolly's office, stole all of the original vouchers that O'Brien, Sturgate, Copeland had copied. Although the crime has never been solved to this day, all fingers, including now those of the ring accomplices Eleganoki Hall and Brain Sweeney, pointed to Slippery Dick Connolly. It was logical. Surely the Comptroller was covering up. There was no honor among these thieves. Curiously, Tweed laid low in Connecticut during this time that fall and made no apparent effort to keep his troops in line. Slippery Dick needed counsel. He was alone. They had abandoned him. He could afford the best. He was advised to seek out Samuel Tilden. When Connolly appeared unannounced at Tilden's office, Tilden, no slouch, instantly grasped several things. First, that he had been given a gift, a key to the Comptroller's office and to the records that could trace the funds to the ring. Second, that he could not represent Connolly, for to do so would compromise the Democratic State Committee, of which he was chairman, by aligning it in the public eye with Tammany. Third, that although the reformers were calling for Connolly's resignation, Connolly's compliance with their demands would actually set back the reformers' cause. And fourth, that his, Tilden's, career was on the line. Within hours, Tilden devised an ingenious solution to this puzzle. First, Tilden advised Connolly that he could not represent him, but that Connolly must not resign as Comptroller, and they must now meet in secret. Second, Tilden unearthed a never-used provision in the city charter, allowing for the appointment of a deputy Comptroller. And he persuaded Connolly to appoint a Tilden crony, one Andrew Haskell Green, to the post. Immediately upon his appointment, Green, under Tilden's direction, accompanied by armed police guards, seized control of the office and its records. Tilden now had unrestricted access to the records that would eventually link the contractor's payments to Tweed's personal accounts. By a stroke of luck, another piece of the payment puzzle now fell into Tilden's hands. One of the contractors, Kaiser, complained that he'd never received many of the payments ascribed to him by the Times. The checks made payable to Kaiser, it developed, bore forged endorsements, but lightly penciled next to the forged endorsements on the back were the initials E.W. E.W. stood for Edwin Woodward. That was Tweed's clerk. Tilden quickly assembled a team of clerks to trace the endorsements and follow the deposit trail of the $6.3 million in checks in the Times chart. It was an ominous precursor to the follow the money guidance of Deep Throat a century later. The forged checks were initially deposited into the clerk Woodward's account, and then the proceeds were secretively laundered through several accounts and eventually to Tweed. Deciphering the Labyrinthian fraud was tedious, requiring the intense and detailed efforts of a barrage of clerks. But Tilden kept his crew at the task night and day. His work would inevitably result in the prosecution of the contractors, the indictment of Tweed, and Tilden's election as governor of New York within 2 years. With the handwriting on the wall, Tweed began to transfer assets to his son Richard, including his New York and Greenwich real estate, his 2 yachts, and his various business interests. On October 26, 1871, only 5 months after he had scaled New York's social heights at his daughter's wedding and the political heights as a potential presidential kingmaker, Tweed was arrested and charged with stealing $6.3 million from the city treasury. On that same day, Tilden's chart, 3 columns wide, was emblazoned across the front page of the New York Times, tracing the serpentine path of a significant portion of the funds, first through Edward and Woodward, and then through a host of others, and eventually into Tweed's bank accounts. Tweed's friends, led by Fisk and Gould, at first rallied around him to post a monumental $3.5 million in bail. But Tweed would have to wait an entire year for his first day in court. Meanwhile, the masses of unpaid workers continued to rage against City Hall. Thomas Nast stepped up his graphic onslaught against Tweed, and the city's financing had come to a crushing halt. As Tweed's political fortunes ebbed, 2 of his fellow ring conspirators not only fell out, they fled the country, as did contractors Ingersoll and Garvey. Slippery Dick Connolly, having opened the door of the city treasury to reform leader Tilden, thought he was safe. He wasn't. In the first of a series of prosecutorial double crosses, he was indicted on Tilden's own affidavit and charged with the theft of $6.3 million from the city treasury. Connolly was briefly jailed, but within a week, his wife reluctantly posted bail. Connolly promptly fled to Canada, then to Europe and Egypt, where he lost a fortune speculating in Egyptian bonds, soon contracted Bright's disease, a disease of the liver, and he died in Europe several years later, impoverished and broken. Tweed's other 2 ring conspirators feared better. Brain Sweeney fled to Paris, lived lavishly there as an expatriate, returned to testify against Tweed under a full grant of immunity, and entered into a settlement of the $6.3 million suit against him for $400,000, the entire sum being paid from his deceased brother's estate. The public would be outraged. The prosecutors would all point fingers at one another. Prosecutorial careers would be ruined. Deals galore would be rumored, but never proven. And Brain Sweeney would live luxuriously in Paris until his death from natural causes in 1911. Elegant Oakey Hall also fared well. Although indicted 3 times by a grand jury, Hall escaped unscathed each time, as the prosecution was unable to prove criminal intent beyond a reasonable doubt. He had not signed checks, only approved vouchers submitted to him by others. Hall lived on until 1899 in New York, enjoying a colorful career, first as a playwright and an actor in his own play called The Crucible, then for his short stint as a journalist, and finally as an attorney. Among his more famous clients were the Russian immigrant anarchist Emma Goldman, who would characterize Elegant Oakey Hall in her memoirs this way, quote, "Oakey Hall was a great jurist, beside being a man of liberal ideas. He had once been mayor of New York, but had proved to be too human and democratic for the politicians," end quote. Words of wisdom from anarchist Emma Goldman. So with the 4 principals of the Tweed Ring, except for Connolly's brief stint in Ludlow prison before his wife posted bail, only Tweed was to spend time behind bars. Following the 1871 revelations, Tweed's descent from grace would be as steep as would be Tilden's ascent to the threshold of the presidency. Tweed would spend the next 7 years both as a prisoner and as a fugitive. His painful descent over these last 7 years reads like an adventure novel cum Greek tragedy. It is filled with irony, despair, hope, and finally betrayal and death. During these years, Tweed would almost miraculously be reelected to the state senate, be indicted, convicted, serve a year and a half in jail, and then upon his release be immediately indicted, arrested, and sent right back again. Like Jean Valjean, he would escape and be pursued by Javert-like characters, including Tilden and various New York prosecutors. And his escape route over the 11-month period would take him in disguise from Weehawken, New Jersey, down the East Coast to the Florida Everglades, where he lived for 6 weeks, to the Florida Keys, then to Cuba, finally to Spain, where he was ironically identified from a Nast cartoon in Harper's Weekly, captured and returned to prison aboard a U.S. frigate. Broken and despondent, when Tweed was returned, he contracted pneumonia in prison and died in Ludlow Street Jail in April 1878, just a few days after his 55th birthday, a lonely and broken man. But why concern ourselves with the downfall of a political brigand over 135 years ago? An unscrupulous politician who fit the Thurman Arnold mold to a T, one who violated most of the principles we cherish. Is this just a morality tale proving that evil has its just rewards? Not really. For there's an aspect of the totality of Tweed's power that is almost unique in American history. Federalist 51 warned prophetically, quote, "In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the greatest difficulty lies in this. You must first enable a government to control the governed, and in the next place, you must oblige it to control itself." On the very few occasions has any clique decimated the separation of powers so carefully crafted by our founding fathers as comprehensively as did the Tweed Ring. Huey Long comes to mind. His control over Louisiana was complete. All three branches of government were under his thumb, just as all three branches of government in New York were under Tweed's, just the nightmare dreaded by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay in the Federalist Papers. Clearly, the Industrial Revolution had wrought tectonic shifts in the moral and economic landscape of 19th century Europe and America. It was a phenomenon that both Joseph Schumpeter and Max Weber had at one time wrestled with. Just as the populist movement, which eventually bred a Huey Long in the 20th century, was born out of the moral bewilderment and paranoia of the agrarian community as its livelihood and its value systems were eroded during the last half of the 19th century, and we'll see that in our talk on Ford later. So too were the livelihoods and value systems of the immigrant city dwellers shaken by impossible living and working conditions that faced them when they arrived in the city. A city whose streets were supposedly paved with gold. The Civil War draft riots, which have perhaps been rivaled in intensity only by the likes of Watts in our time, revealed the stark existence of an underclass. The notorious 5 Points on the Lower East Side was teeming with gangs of their ragged, underfed, and understandably uncontrollable progeny. They were not simply indifferent to the cause of the emancipation of the Negro, a cause into which they would be conscripted by Lincoln. It was anathema to them. The emancipation of the Negro threatened whatever threadbare livelihood the Irish immigrants had been able to eke out in this new world. And so tragically, the first object of their fury and frustration during the draft riots was a Negro orphanage, which was burned to the ground. Tweed understood their plight and was able to diffuse and solve the draft problem, much to the relief of Lincoln. Just as Huey Long understood the plight of the Cajuns, exploited by monoliths such as upstate planters, utilities, railroads, and Standard Oil of Louisiana a half-century later. Tweed's Tammany was a shelter, perhaps the only shelter in the storm. Who cared if the ballot boxes were stuffed? Who cared whether the courts were fixed and judges dutifully signed naturalization certificates night and day at election time? Or that the lights conveniently went out as the vote counting began? Who cared if the legislature and the courts were being auctioned off to the highest bidder, and if the highest bidder was Tweed? More power to him. Tweed was a Galahad. The jobs were there, and somebody finally gave a damn about their plight in this new world. And so the specter envisioned and most feared by Hamilton and Madison had come to pass. Tweed converted the frustration of a repressed underclass into a political absolute, if only for a short time. But during that truncated period of 3 years, he was not only able to embezzle a fortune, he had become a force to be reckoned with on the national political scene, already being rumored as a presidential kingmaker. Huey Long rode the similar political tailwinds of a Cajun underclass to a seat in the United States Senate. And at the time of his assassination in 1935, he was well on his way to combining with Father Charles Coughlin and Dr. Francis Everett Townsend to form a potentially deadly political triumvirate. It was the scenario that FDR and his political mentor, Louis Howe, feared the most. The breakdown in the checks and balances which so terrified Hamilton and Madison is a phenomenon against which we must forever be vigilant if our fragile democratic institutions are to survive. The existence of a repressed underclass is always a warning sign of a potential crack in the armor of our Constitution. If we learn nothing else from the meteoric rise and fall of the unscrupulous William Marcy Tweed, that lesson will have been enough. Thank you.